Let me come back to India and talk to you about what we could expect in terms of the next big-ticket economic reform, and that has to do with the goods and services tax, long pending. And the last conversation that you and I had, we talked about the possibility of the GST coming through and what it would mean as far as the Indian economy is concerned. We know that it will, in the long term, have a positive implication and a positive impact for the economy. But traditionally and typically, as you've sort of seen the rollout of the GST across different geographies, what does it mean in the short to medium term as far as the economy is concerned?
Well, I think, like any major reform, I think the short-term transition can always be challenging in a number of respects. So I think there is great confidence, to the point you just made, that long-term the GST tax will be a positive thing for the economy here and for businesses here, frankly. Having said that, moving from the existing operation, the existing standards, the existing taxes that are in place, excuse me, and evolving to the GST will create disruptions, and it creates some uncertainties in terms of exactly how it will affect my business as you roll out some forms of taxes and replace them with the GST. But these are the kind of reforms, and I think it's consistent with the conversation we just had about China. I think it's very important for governments like India to recognize that notwithstanding the fact that you may experience short-term disruptions, it's incredibly important to implement the kind of longer-term reforms that we believe will create a more stable and ultimately more sustainable economic environment. And I think that's the view with GST. And you're absolutely right, though, in the short term, there will be some winners, losers, disruptions. And I think that's just one of the prices you have to pay to ultimately get on a more stable footing.
We don't have clarity or finality on the rate just yet, but there has been a recommendation of a committee that was set up by the government, and they've arrived at a number of about 18%. To your mind, would that be good news? Would that it is still higher than the global average, though?
You know, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer whether that's the right rate or not. I think what is important is to settle in on a rate that balances out the competing objectives. On the one hand, to replace some other tax regimes with the GST, do it in a way that doesn't depress investment and adversely impact economic growth, and do all that while balancing the need for revenues from the state standpoint. So I don't know what the magic sweet spot answer to that is. That's going to, I think, require a lot of effort by the government working with business leaders here. But I think that's the goal, is to hit that sweet spot of not hurting the economic growth that is out there, but at the same time generate the kind of revenue that the government needs to implement the kind of reforms and investments that it needs to make.
Mr. Veihmeyer, let me also ask you about another global challenge that we're seeing, and that is the move towards the BEPS regulations. What is it going to mean in terms of redrawing the way that businesses are run at this point in time, the way that businesses are structured, where they're headquartered, where they operate from? Is this going to force significant changes, at least over the next few years, as more and more countries adopt the BEPS?
Well, I think regulation is one of those areas that is very much on the minds of CEOs. As I mentioned earlier, it's the second highest concern when you talk about risks and concerns on the part of CEOs. Right after cyber comes regulation. And frankly, I think one of the concerns that business leaders have is not about the regulations itself. I think most business leaders I speak with believe that smart regulation is critical, and it's an important element of restoring and continuing to build the trust in business that we all want to see. Having said that, what is very challenging at the moment is the divergence in regulatory regimes across the many jurisdictions that companies operate in today. So dealing with very different regulations on key issues like data transfer and data security just being one, where multiple countries have very different requirements and standards, and that's what I think is not only expensive for companies to comply with when you're operating in multiple countries, but also makes it very difficult from a competitive standpoint to create level playing fields, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, the biggest challenge in regulation is the inconsistency in some very important areas where regulatory policies have a big impact on the success or failure of companies. The inconsistencies in many of those regulations across jurisdictions is something that I think business has to continue to work closely with governments on to try and narrow those gaps to the extent we possibly can.
Well, that certainly is a risk, but let me end by asking you, Mr. Veihmeyer, the survey says that 72% of the CEOs expect the next 3 years to be more crucial than the next 50 years, and 41% expect significant transformation over the next 3 years. In this context, do you believe that the Fortune 500 list that we're used to looking at over the last few years is going to look very, very different a couple of years down the line?
I think it absolutely will. If you just look at history as a precursor of the future, you know, we've seen a lot of change in the Fortune 500 over the last 10 to 20 years. And I think the one thing that you can be sure of is that the one constant we're experiencing today is that the pace of change is radically accelerated. And so on anything you look at, like how quickly are the participants and the members of the Fortune 500 turning over, I think you should expect to see more change, and particularly when you look at what's happening from an innovation standpoint and companies that are very rapidly transforming industries and going from 6 to 7 years ago, a company like Uber that didn't exist 7 years ago and today is radically transforming the transportation industry. We're going to see more and more of that as we go forward. And so, yes, I think we should anticipate continued disruption and a lot of change across the dimension that you just asked about.
Well, one thing's for certain, disruption is going to be the order of the day, but watch out for trends on how companies try and prevent themselves from being disrupted, and of course the regulatory risks and the geopolitical risks that they are going to have to grapple with along the way. But Mr. Veihmeyer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18 and taking us through the important findings of the KPMG CEO survey. Certainly does paint a better picture, more optimism and confidence today in comparison to the outlook last year. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me on. I look forward to seeing you the next time I'm in India.
Thanks very much. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this CNBC-TV18 special. From all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.